QuantSpeak, expert insights from quants for quants.
Welcome to QuantSpeak, a new podcast from the CQF Institute at Fitch Learning.
Hi, I'm Dan Tudball, editor of Wilmot Magazine, and this is QuantSpeak. Emanuel Derman needs little introduction. You've learned and implemented the Black-Derman-Toy short rate model, just as you did the Derman-Kani local volatility model. To many, the Platonic ideal of the union of science and finance is to be found in that period from 1990 to 2000, when Emanuel ran the quantitative strategies group at Goldman Sachs. When you were considering quantitative finance as a career, you read My Life as a Quant. When you were trying to make sense of the subprime and global financial crises, you turned to models behaving badly. Now, Emanuel is preparing to take us back to the very beginning with his next book, which he describes as a bio-fictional memoir of his formative years in Cape Town, South Africa. Welcome, Emanuel.
Hey, thank you very much, Dan. I'm happy to be here.
I'm very pleased to be here. It's an honor. Thank you. The title of the new book is Brief Hours and Weeks, My Life as a Capetonian. And you're currently working on ideas for the cover of the book. And the quote from Shakespeare there is, love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. Sonnet 116, as you've introduced me to. What's behind the title and what's behind the book?
Well, the book, actually, it's no longer biographical. It grew out of a Substack that I wrote. I disguised I made up little bits and I fictionalized a little bit. In a way, I was influenced by J.M. Coetzee, who's a famous South African writer who wrote several autobiographical novels, but he marketed them as novels called Boyhood, Youth, and Summertime. And I really liked them. I liked them better than his novels. Then he's non-biographical. And anyway, when I wrote the Substack, I called it biographical because I didn't know there was a word called autofiction, which describes that kind of thing. But it's no longer biographical. It's really just a memoir about growing up in a immigrant Jewish sort of cloistered community in Cape Town in the 50s and 60s, maybe even the late 40s and the 50s mostly, early 60s. Yeah, my parents were immigrants from Poland before World War II. I lived in a small Jewish community where everybody's parents had an accent, and we all lived in a very sort of incestuous sort of way, for lack of a better word. So that's what it's about. My first 21 years.
It's certainly interesting in that the South African elections are just occurring at this point in time, and your reflections on that period in South Africa. Certainly, there is so much formative stuff that's going on there that influenced the way that you have thought about things through your career and through your later life. Would you point to two or three that you might say have come out in the themes of the book?
Yes, I would. I just want to hop back, if I can, for 1 second about the title, partly because it's related to your editor, Paul, as well. So when I wrote the Substack, I called it My Life as an African, with a sort of homage to my life as a quant. And that was okay. But when I started to look for a title for the book, various people told me I couldn't use My Life as an African because I'm white and I grew up in South Africa, but I'm not entitled, or it's cultural appropriation to call myself an African. And I sort of ignored that at first. And then Paul told me the same thing, warned me that I would alienate people and maybe get canceled. And Paul's such a professional provocateur that when he said that, I took it seriously.
I can imagine so. Because if it's coming from him, I would take that. In terms of those sort of foundational traits, would you be able to point to any that start to draw out or start to establish Emanuel Derman as he would be?
I grew up in a very Jewish, inward-looking community, small. So that played a very big part in my life. I was part of a youth movement of which a lot of people wanted to go and live in a kibbutz in Israel. They were sort of socialists. And a lot of my friends eventually did that. And I was part of that for a long time. I never did that in the end, but that had a very big effect on me in some way. It was sort of intellectually interesting. It was socially constricting. I sort of got to dislike being part of groups, I think, from that experience. I admired them, but it had a bit of a cult-like quality to it after a while. I've always sort of disliked, I don't even say disliked, I've always sort of been uncomfortable being part of big social groups.
There is actually, well, there's a link there, isn't there, there's a section in Models Behaving Badly, I think,
Yes.
where you were actually talking about that aspect of things. So this kind of, the new work sort of expands on what the context was for that, then, I guess.
Yes, you've got a very good memory. Yeah, in Model Behaving Badly, I wrote about the Jewish group I belonged to, that their aim was sort of socialism and living on a kibbutz in Israel, and everybody took it very seriously. It was a different world back then, in 1955 to 1965. I wrote about it more philosophically in Models Behaving Badly, about I called it a model that you couldn't trust in the end, and that the world changed. And in this book, in brief hours and weeks, I write. It's really autobiographical about my experience with that and the good and bad effects it had on me.
Poetry is evidently important to you throughout your work. It's obviously the choice of a Shakespearean sonnet for the title. I haven't read all the way to the end of the book, so I don't know what whereabouts the quote for the sonnet actually comes up. What's behind that?
Oh, I can tell you, there's one chapter in there called "The Red and the Black." You know, I'm sidestepping a little bit. In my life as a quant, I actually named every chapter after a book that I'd read, and every chapter, Easy Travel to Other Planets, and I can't remember the others offhand now, but they were all book titles. And this chapter in Brief Hours and Lives is called "The Red and the Black," a little bit related to a love story by Stendhal, if I'm remembering it correctly. And I read that once about a younger guy meeting an older woman, and this is a little bit, a little episode, something like that, and I called it "The Red and the Black." And somewhere in there, I say that I was suddenly reminded of this Shakespearean sonnet by something that this woman said and did. And it's, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds." I know it by heart. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds," etc., etc. And brief hours and weeks comes from there. Love's not time's fool. I had another chapter called "Time's Fool," because it says, "Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks." Brief hours and weeks, my life as a Capetonian, about living there. Related to a sort of, I wouldn't say a real love affair, but a half imagined, half real love affair.
Fantastic recall there. And I mean, it brings up the idea of constancy. So would you say that there is a constant for you, a defining thread, perhaps, something that will, for you, bear out until the edge of doom?
That's a good question. I want to say I feel I'm getting very old, but I feel like I haven't changed since I was a 10-year-old, you know?
I can feel that too.
Yeah, I don't like being parts of groups. I don't like being insulted. I think I'm kind of loyal to the people that I know. I've got a very good memory for the past. People sometimes ask me, related to that book and related to my life as a quant, how do you remember all those things? And I don't know, but they really stick in my mind very sharply. And I have a section in the book that says, I forget what the chapter's called, but I try to describe, it's a little bit inward looking maybe, but I try to describe my character traits, and I say the past is always with me.
Yes, I recall that actually, and I was going to bring it up, but I think that's one that the readers should save. You know, we're fortunate enough that you're allowing us to publish an extract from the book, a chapter entitled "Distant Drums," which deals with your decision to move on from the University of Cape Town and do, as you say, physics your physics PhD in either England or the States, and it's serendipity in the form of a bad case of acne that ultimately led you to Columbia University in New York.
That's accurate, yes.
That'll be coming out in the July issue. At that point, that would have been 65, I guess.
Yes, that's right, yes.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about physics. For those who haven't had the chance to read, when did it actually become an important part of your life? And with this chapter that we're publishing, there is obviously this urge to go where you will be able to do more and have access to the latest approaches and the best teachers and so on. But how did that momentum start for you that brings us to this chapter that we're going to publish?
You know, I finished high school, God help me, in 1961. I was a year young, and I went to college in 1962 to University of Cape Town. And I started taking physics. Yeah, you know, it's like the English system, I'm sure you know, where you have to specialize right from the get-go. And I took physics, pure math, applied math, chemistry. And then after a year, I did physics and applied math and pure math. And then in my third and fourth year, I just did physics and applied math. And I sort of discovered I was good at it. I mean, I always liked it, but I didn't know what I was going to do. Then I did pretty well in physics and applied math. I say somewhere, I don't know if I say it in there, but I say I had this, I don't want to say illusion that I wanted to find out the way that the universe worked and the laws of nature, et cetera, et cetera. I still take it seriously, but I took it even more seriously then. And so it grew on me. I was sorry that I couldn't do some arts as well. It was virtually impossible. You had to do either science or art. And then eventually I started to realize, as I describe in that chapter, I think that Cape Town was a bit of a backwater, although maybe not as much as I thought. And that if I wanted to do, you know, quantum mechanics and particle physics and maybe relativity, that everybody, I suddenly realized that everybody who was serious was making plans for going overseas.
There's a Freud quote. It was something to do with him missing his son or something like that and ruining the invention of the train or something like that.
I'll tell you why it meant something to me, but it's Freud. He said, I'm glad, in German somewhere, I'm happy that I can talk to my son in London on the telephone, but I wouldn't have to do it if they hadn't invented the train or something like that. And yeah, I think one of the things that's been a constant in my life is related to that. I'm a little bit shocked that I left Cape Town. It's more than 50 years ago, but I had a very hard time when I left Cape Town and came to America. You know, it was, I don't know, 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000 miles away. There was no internet. There was virtually no telephone connection. You could nobody will know this anymore, but you could make a 3-minute call if you paid a vast amount of money and just shout, hello, hello, I love you, goodbye, sort of, you know. It was like a million miles away. You couldn't be as far from anywhere in the world now as you were then between New York and Cape Town. And I got kind of a little depressed when I landed in New York in 1966. You know, it didn't. I never imagined it would happen to me. And then the minute I flew across the Atlantic and was halfway, I've been in Israel, halfway between Israel and New York, suddenly I realized that I was all alone in the world, so to speak. And it had a very big effect on me. I sort of got really, really shocked. So I think that's been a constant in my life to some extent. I don't want to say fear of being alone, but something like that.
Yeah, that calls to mind you saying something about even being reluctant to hang up the telephone because it feels like a form of rejection.
Yes. I said that in the part about my character. I think that my sister was like that. She didn't like to say goodbye on the telephone. I used to speak to her a lot in Cape Town. And I'm a bit like that. I don't want to say goodbye to people. I hang on, you know. It's good quality and a bad quality in some ways. Yeah, I say somewhere in the book I was a little shocked at how little I knew about myself, that I left and didn't realize that I was going to be miserable for a while.
And 1966 was a year of huge upheaval as well. So you found yourself in a situation where, I guess, socially and culturally, things were all over the place as well. So it wasn't just a matter of moving geographically.
Yes.
Without that kind of interlinkedness that we celebrate and rue somewhat these days.
Yes.
You had absolutely no idea that you're plonking yourself into this sort of maelstrom of something that historians of ideas probably have a better phrase for, but you know what I mean.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it was I like New York. I actually love New York, although it's not quite as good as it was. It was a shock to my system. And New York's actually a good city, maybe less so now than before, but it's always been a very good place for foreigners. You know, half the city is foreign, and you can be foreign without really worrying about it.
Yes, exactly. Well, you know, you're talking about you're miserable, and to fast forward a bit, I do recall, obviously, you didn't end up in finance until 85 or so. You were already on the cusp of or at 40 years old at that point.
That's
And
true.
you were at places like AT&T and so on before. Those weren't particularly happy times for you either, but you stuck it out. What was it that made you commit to being in the States rather than taking the PhD back to South Africa?
Oh, you mean after I got a PhD?
Yeah.
Oh, I got a PhD. It was a long slog, actually. I got a PhD in 1973. At that point, I was married already. I got married in 1969, end of 1969. I wanted to continue doing physics. I was kind of ambitious. That never really left me in some way. Yeah, I just went on the treadmill of trying to stay in physics. It was hard to find jobs. It was hard to find jobs in the same city as your wife if you were both in a two-career family. So I had a sequence of postdocs and then an assistant professorship. But it's very hard to get tenure. I was at University of Colorado in 1979, and I was an assistant professor and I was tenure track, but my wife couldn't get a job there and I couldn't get a job in physics back in New York. And eventually I went to work at AT&T Bell Labs in 1980. And I really hated that, although I learned a lot of very useful stuff. I was kind of happy in physics, more or less. And then I worked for 5 years in industry at AT&T, which was still a giant single company at that point before they underwent deregulation. And I learned a lot. I learned how to program. I learned Unix. I learned how to be a good programmer at the time. But it was a very bureaucratic environment with many levels and everybody trying to climb over your back to get to the next level. I didn't really feel comfortable. And I wanted to do research again, and too late to get into physics. So, long story short, I took a job at Goldman. And
Right.
I was really and I moved to finance and felt like I was doing research in finance, and there were users, and I really loved it.
Your father had expressed a preference or had encouraged the academic life in you on the basis that if you're an academic, you only have to take your ideas with you, and therefore you'll be able to get a job anywhere. And that was the irony of it, that period after finishing your PhD and so on, that actually finding academic positions was incredibly difficult.
Yes, I mean, my father was academically oriented, but was in business when he became an immigrant to South Africa. And yeah, he always used to say, yeah, you can go anywhere. It was sort of a bit of a wandering Jew trope, you know, which was true. My
Right.
parents left Poland before the Germans invaded Poland, long before. They just left Poland because a lot of Jewish people were leaving Poland. Some of their relatives went to to America and to Israel. They came to South Africa. And you had the feeling that that you might have to do that again. And it was good to have a career that you could take with you. So it was kind of ironic. I ended up in physics, and you had to go exactly where there was a job. And in a way, it's propagated a little bit to my son. My son is a professor in Hong Kong. He's very happy there, but we sometimes laugh that my wife's family and mine all emigrated, and then to their countries, and then I emigrated here, and now he's somewhat emigrated to Hong Kong for sort of more or less academic reasons.
Yes, absolutely. Who knows what genetically it is that prompts these things as well.
There's a lot of people now who claim things are epigenetic, if you know what I mean. I don't quite believe it, but that your experience in life can get propagated genetically.
Yes, I find that rather odd. I put that in the same category as these people who are talking about using brain cells to more efficiently power computer processors because they use less energy.
I
It's,
hadn't heard that.
a rather scary thought. So who
Yes.
knows what those brain cell powered computers will epigenetically end up becoming. So we get to 1985 and you get to Goldman Sachs, you plunge into finance. And in your books, you mentioned that Ravi Dattatreya was your first all-round guide to finance and financial software. Reflections on the importance of guides in careers? I mean, especially at this juncture in your life, you were no longer a spring chicken.
Oh no, I wasn't. Yeah, I was saved by going to Goldman Sachs in some way because I turned 40 that year, and it was sort of a second or maybe a third career for me if you count the software at Bell Labs as a second career after physics. And I was really saved. I sometimes tell people, who are having trouble with finding a happy career that I was 40 when I started doing that, and it ended up kind of well for me. But it was like a shot in the arm for me. I really loved it. I loved um, I loved learning finance because it was a little bit like physics. I loved the fact that there were people in the same building who like experiment. Like I was a theoretical, I was a theoretical physicist, so to speak, and they were the experimentalists. And you spoke to them and try to understand what their problems were, and then try to solve it with theory, which is sort of what I'd done in physics. So I really liked it. And Ravi Dattatreya, I don't know where he is now. He was a very smart Indian guy who was my first boss at Goldman for about 6 months before he left for greener pastures. Um, he understood the way the world worked, and I tell the story in the book that I spent a lot of time rewriting a model that he wrote and improving it. And after about a couple of weeks, he got impatient. He sort of scared me a little bit and said, and I was taking too long. And he said to me, sort of rebuking me, he said, in this business, you only need three, not three skills, three operations: addition, multiplication, and maybe occasionally division. Yeah, there was something metaphorically correct about that. And I think finance, and it was a good thing to hear from him. And finance, I think to some extent has done the opposite in some ways. It's gotten very axiomatic and theoretical in a way that I don't like, and in a way that Paul Wilmot, who's your editor and my friend, I know he agrees with me on that matter.
Yes, precisely. Easy travel to other planets in my life as a quant. It talks about the impact that Fisher Black had on you, your own letting go of any ambitions to a grand unifying theory in finance, and also only mentioned as an aside, I think, but important, the defense of the value of quants within the financial institution and how that could be so easily abused. For me, it's a very important chapter for quants to digest. Any reflections on that?
Yeah, a lot of things go through my head. I'm not sure I can get them in order, but Fisher was an amazing guy. He died very young in 1995. I said somewhere else once in something I wrote about him as a not an obituary, as a sort of reflection. He was sort of, there's a quote by, what is her name? Lionel Schreiber. She's an English writer.
Okay.
And she says somewhere, I saw her quoted somewhere, I don't know, maybe in The Spectator or something. And she said, in politics, one should always dine a la carte, meaning that, you shouldn't belong to some party. You should pick your opinions based on what you thought about them, not because they were part of some general world picture. And Fisher
True.
was kind of like that about the world in general. I had said that, but not so succinctly as she did, that you couldn't tell what his view about something else would be based on everything you knew about his views on related topics, because he thought about everything sort of ab initio. Sometimes it was kind of irritating, but he came at everything fresh, and at finance too, and at each finance problem, and he would listen to anybody, no matter how junior, and take what they said seriously, and ignore them pretty soon if he thought they were wrong, and not waste his time. But he wouldn't explain things at great length. But all his opinions were like that. They were a la carte. They weren't part of some global political or picture.
Right.
So he was kind of impressive, and also he didn't rely too much on math. I mean, he was a reasonably good mathematician, but he wasn't a brilliant one like Merton. But he liked to think about everything in a very visceral sort of way and then mathematize it. It was kind of impressive, and I liked that way of doing things. And I liked his view about research, which Wall Street has moved away from. But I was able to do that for the 10 years that I ran his group after him, quantitative trading, which was to do research and to publish it and to straddle the line, which he did, to straddle the line between academia and business, and have one foot in both camps. And I really liked that middle ground. I was having dinner last night with Steve Allen, who used to be a risk manager at JP Morgan, and then was involved in the financial math program at Courant for a long time. And he was saying that people were amazed in my group at Goldman at the time, in the 1990 to 2000, at the way we published our results about local volatility and BDT before that. It didn't come easy, I'm rambling a bit, but I had a struggle to get to that point. The instinct of everybody at Goldman and my bosses, once Fisher was gone, was not to publish anything, but to keep it secret. But slowly but surely, I overcame that. I don't quite know how. It's gone now. I don't think the world is like that anymore.
No, precisely. I mean, the part that I was alluding to about the defense of the value of quants, you mentioned that you would always keep a little snippet of code in your work that would actually track how many times somebody had accessed it. And then later on, you were able to use it as a form of evidence as to the value, because it was so difficult to say how close quants were to the money, right? And you saved a whole bunch of jobs there.
Yeah, you do have a good memory. Yeah. I think that was, I'm trying to remember whether that was when I was in fixed income or whether I was already in quantitative strategy. But yeah, at that time and when I was at Bell Labs, in a way, I got to dislike what I called middlemen, were the people who stood between the quants and the traders. We were building software and models for the traders, but there was a whole category of people who intermediated between us. And I don't want to say wanted to take credit, but maybe wanted to take credit for it and be our managers. And I always disliked that. And that's partly why I put that line in our code, to show that it counted the number of times people used some particular part of the option pricing program, which we had written. Well, we'd written the whole thing. But anyway, yeah, it was, I think the world has changed. In those days, traders weren't numerate. IT was much more powerful than quants. They wanted to run us. We had a battle against them. And we sort of won at that point. But now the world has changed. A, traders are very numerate. B, being a quantitative person is now a badge of pride. Being a quant rather than being a pejorative word. So it's a totally different world. People are proud of being a quantitative person now.
Yes, exactly. Whereas in those days, particularly the 80s, people were rather fond of being the pejorative word.
Yes. People at Goldman, even in the early 90s or the mid 90s, they didn't want to put PhD on their I never did that, but people didn't want to put. I knew people who didn't want to put PhD on their business card because it was sort of a mark of Cain,
With regard to Black-Derman-Toy short rate model, in that chapter, you said something about you were hoping that what you'd come up with, it was sort of the last twinklings of your thought that there might be a grand unifying theory and that this might be applied across the board and so on. And Fisher Black sort of disabused you of that notion.
Yes, that's very accurate. That was done when I was 1 year out of Bell Labs and still sort of finance as a kind of physics. It's really more a kind of applied math. And yeah, somehow maybe thought that, not maybe, I thought that BDT might be the basis for a general theory of all fixed income. And Fisher, who knew much more about the real world at that point than I did, about the real trading world, was quite happy with the idea. Not even happy, was much more certain about the idea that each market sector would have its own model and they didn't all need to be consistent, and that there wasn't any overarching theory like that. And it took me a couple more years before I got to experience that myself when I worked on local volatility and really understood that these were all approximations calibrated to the way people were temporarily behaving, and that it might change and could change from market sector to market sector.
Absolutely. Actually, the next one's going to be on that period, the local vol period. But I've always found it ironic that Robert Merton's dad originated the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. That's something well worth bearing in mind anywhere in finance.
Yes.
Your description of the period when you were working on the local volatility model with Iraj Khani, it's undeniably exciting. I mean, it reads, in some parts, it reads like a industrial espionage type thing.
Yeah.
And, with the discovery that Bruno de Peer was also working on the same problem and needing permissions to allude to your work in private conversations with people like John Hull and so on. Do you think the context exists now for that kind of intellectual competition and camaraderie?
I think not in finance anymore. I mean, finance has gotten, I don't know what goes on in the sell side really very well anymore. Everybody's much more secretive. The mathematics has gotten much more complicated. I have a feeling the AI world is closer to that than the finance world at this point.
Right. Yes.
You read about different people competing to put out their chat GPT type large language models, and it has more of that feel. And some people are publishing and some people aren't. Some people are open source. I don't think finance is like that anymore. But I'm not really at the forefront for the last 5 years, but I don't get the feeling it's like that. And nobody in industry publishes anymore. Nobody really tells you what they're doing. It's a changed world. They're all a lot of them are trying to use AI now.
Yes, exactly. Well, I guess it's where the focal point of commodification is really. And I guess now personal data is oil.
Sorry, I couldn't catch what you said. Personal
I
data.
guess,
Yeah, they've gobbled up all the written material in the whole world now. There's not much more for them to get.
my boss, Paul Wilmot, he makes an appearance in the chapter The Great Pretender at the end of My Life as a Quant. And in there, there's a lovely quote that you have where you say, personality plays a larger part in economic writing because truth's part is smaller. You were commenting there on his book title, actually, Wilmot on Derivatives. The Wilmot in the title implies that a difficult subject is being explained by an authority, but it also suggests that the subject matter itself lacks the coherence of true science. I mean, that's very much one of the motivations behind the Financial Modeller's Manifesto. In fact, whose idea was it to base the manifesto on Marx's Communist Manifesto?
I don't remember. Paul and I, it was like 2009, maybe. Paul and I were in different places, but communicating. And we've always had a similar view of finance. I don't remember. I want to say it's mine, but I'm actually absolutely not sure. But yeah, we had a similar view. I'm kind of proud of that thing, although it's somewhere on Wikipedia. It didn't really have much effect. But recently, there was an article in the New York Times about cosmology, an interview with an article with some physicist who was doing cosmology, and he cited the Financial Modeller's Manifesto as saying they should have something similar for physicists. The part about you've always swept dirt under the rug when you build your models, but you should make clear to everybody what the dirt is and where it is. And he thought physicists should do that with their climate models and cosmological models as well. Yeah, and I know some of the people in data science have sort of done similar things. It's a little idealistic. The world keeps sticking on.
Well, it does that, yes, has a tendency. Now, I've seen you talking about P-quants and Q-quants. So P-quants modeling the future and Q-quants sort of extrapolating from the present. Is it a useful delineation? And do you think the Q has really been on the ascendant since the financial crisis?
I think it is a useful delineation. When I started, I've always been a Q quant, meaning looking at the present, backing out the implied probabilities, the Q probabilities, the risk neutral, so-called risk neutral probabilities, and then using them, calibrating. I know Paul doesn't like calibration, but let me set that aside. Calibrating to one set of liquid instruments, and then using the model to value other illiquid instruments. And that's what Q quants do. So it's using the present to calibrate a future, and then using the liquid present to calibrate a future, and then using that calibrated future to come back to calculate the value of something illiquid in the present. That's most like physics, actually, the models and the syntax and even some of the semantics. P quants are people who do statistics. And calculate what they think are, do correlations, do fancy versions of correlations, and do even AI type models, and try to figure out what will happen in the future. And much less reliable, at least until now, but much more popular. I think P quants are in the ascendant. Did you say Q quants?
Right.
Yeah. No, I think it's P quants that are in the ascendant, because there's just so much historical data now with electronic markets, which didn't exist in the 90s,
Yes.
and certainly not in the 80s and 70s. And so there's this vast amount of data you can do statistics on. And so I think P quants are in the ascendant.
Yes.
And hedge funds, asset managers, et cetera, all mostly P quants.
Actually, I read an interesting article recently. It's about quantum mechanics, but it was about Soviet antipathy towards subjectivity influencing the debate on quantum mechanics. So this goes back to Niels Bohr's complementarity. The Soviets were sort of, well, this doesn't fit in with materialism, whatever. It sounds too positivist and all of that. And then you end up with that sort of influences the debate. And then you have the EPR experiment, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment, which led to David Bohm effectively setting things up for the way that quantum mechanics would be discussed up until this point. What I found interesting about that article was to do with ideological influences on hard science, as it were. Do you think that that's still an issue? I mean, is that something that is well worth considering nowadays in terms of where the motivations for science are coming from? It was just interesting to me because it was quantum mechanics, but then having seen this sort of laid out as a sort of a philosophical debate, is there space for, well, in terms of the way that David Bohm responded to the EPR experiment?
Do you mean by having pilot waves and saying that there was...
Yes. Bohm tended to think in a more sort of, I suppose, philosophical and metaphysical kind of way, which wasn't particularly popular at that point in time in the sciences. But that led to further work, which formed the underpinnings of things now. For one thing, it effectively established entanglement as a real thing that you really ought to consider. Yes. And if he hadn't been thinking in that way, if he hadn't been thinking sort of out of the box, then, albeit with certain political preferences, we might not have arrived at that. From your viewpoint, as a person with a firm grounding in the hard sciences and so on, at the point at which we are now, do you think that there's more space for that kind of free thinking
Yes, I understand what you're alluding to now. Actually, just on a sidebar, poor David Boehm, he was damned by the House Un-American Activities Committee and had to go to Brazil and had to leave America and all kinds of stuff, and he prospered despite that. But yeah, you're referring to something that's sort of dear to my heart in a way, and my sort of hobby horse and my bête noire, which is I write about it in Models Behaving Badly. I really think everybody's obsessed with behavioral finance and biases and the mistakes that people make in thinking and how people don't understand probability and all this kind of stuff. And there's some element of truth to that, but I think I think they over exaggerate it. The really big, David Boehm is an example, but the really big discoveries in the world, the really great discoveries in the world don't come from logic. They come from intuition, where, Kepler discovering Kepler's laws, Newton discovering Newton's laws, Maxwell discovering discovering the missing part of Maxwell's equation, Dirac with the positron antiparticles. None of these things follow from logic. They come from somewhere mysterious. People forget that, and they want everybody to be like, I'm not denying the need for logic, but the really great earth-shattering ideas and discoveries about the way the world behaves don't come from logic, but come from some kind of intuition that is beyond all that. And that's kind of dear to my heart. I mean, of course, one can have lots of wrong intuition, but logic only starts once you've had that intuition, like force equals mass times acceleration and the inverse square law, and then you can work out the consequences. But those F equals ma from Newton or Maxwell's equations, that doesn't come from logic. That comes from some internal source of God knows what. Keynes had a great speech about Newton, which I quote in my book, where he says, everybody thinks Newton was the first of the great rationalists, but actually he was the last of the great magicians that are related to the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the way they saw the world 10,000 years ago. And he says nobody ever had intuition and the capacity for concentration like Newton. And my very limited experience with discovering very minor things in the world are consistent with that.
Thank you. That leads on to another question I wanted to ask, I guess at a tangent. Had today's computing power been available in the late 1970s, would physics still have become the dominant analogy in financial theory for 40 years, do you think?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I didn't start doing finance until 1985, and then people already had some what they then called supercomputers and parallel computers. Maybe not. I mean, if there'd been electronic markets in the 70s, I think things would have been very different, and the statistical approach would have been much more dominant than the p-quant approach, than the q-quant approach. The p-quant isn't really physics. It's I don't know what to call it. It's statistics, and the q-quant one is more physics-like, and maybe you're right, it does thrive in a way on a lack of information.
Yes, because I was just wondering, if that had been the case, then a statistical approach combined with social sciences and wanting to model the world one-to-one might have become the dominant thing rather than trying to find elegant, quick solutions for specific problems.
Yes, that's very insightful. I think that never occurred to me, and I think you're right. If there'd been a lot of electronic data, people would have focused much more on predicting the future from the past. They did somewhat, but they would have been able to do it much more, I don't want to say successfully, but much more, maybe successfully and certainly much more thoroughly than they were able to do at that point. When I worked at Goldman in the mid-90s, the traders told you the implied volatility at the end of the day by going around and talking to them. We used to write it down.
I mean, you could say quantitative finance is about implications.
Yes. Yes.
I should wrap up. One question I wanted to ask you is, do you think that math is discovered or invented?
Can I say yes?
That's probably the best answer.
Yeah.
Well, Oh,
I don't know. I would have liked to say discovered. I'm a bit of a Platonist in a way, but I'm not totally sure.
certainly, or uncertainly, as the case may be.
That's good.
Thank you very much for your time this morning, Emanuel. It's been a real pleasure. When do you expect the hard copy of the new book to be out?
Oh, I don't know. It's being published by a small place in London, the London Mathematical Lab, that wants to have their own imprint. I'm not sure. I don't know. I would guess 3 or 4 months.
Okay. Well, we'll keep tabs on that, and we'll certainly let everybody know once it's out there. Well, thank you once more, Emanuel Derman. For our listeners, CQF Institute members can have access to Emanuel's talks at the CQF Institute, and he's done a few. But the last one was actually last year's Black-Scholes 50th anniversary panel discussion with Robert Litterman. For CQF Institute members, you're able to access that online. If you're not a member, you should be, because it's free, and it's a great talk there as well for you to catch up on. Thanks very much, Emanuel.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you for such insightful questions and such a good knowledge about the background.
Well, have a very good morning, and thanks again for contributing the chapter to the magazine and all of that.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to QuantSpeak. Don't forget to subscribe, and do sign up to the CQF Institute for more insights into quant finance.